All right, kids, here we are back, and all of those that are joining us on YouTube, and someday you'll be watching the video as well. But glad to be back on this obviously frigid day. I wish the fireplace was in place here in the library recording studio, but the fireplace is not installed yet, and so it is like burr cold this winter day. Not as cold as some places, but you know what? We're at a high right now of -7, so I'm nice and toasty. So I think that's fun. Anyway, let's get to it. We are going to continue what we're reading. My favorite book right now is what? Yeah, it's the Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution that was published in 1864 by Mr. J.T. Headley. Wonderful. And this chapter, again, we're past that halfway mark, but we're keeping on going. And here's a fun part. So let's get on with chapter 25. And this is John Gano. And here's what we're going to read about and learn about Pastor John Gano today. The Baptist of Virginia. Gano's early life, visits the South and preaches, arraigned for it, but is acquitted and licensed. Anecdotes of his coolness and courage. Settled in North Carolina. Offered a captain's commission in the army against the Cherokees. Declines. Returns north. Finally settles in New York. His congregation broken up. Joins the army as chaplain. Under fire at White Plains. At Trenton. Chaplain under Clinton at Fort Montgomery. His description of the taking of the fort, with Clinton's brigade at Albany, its chaplain in the expedition against the Indians, anecdotes of him in the campaign, sermon on the 4th of July, his faithfulness, goes south with the army advancing against Cornwallis, returns to his church at the close of the war, removes to Kentucky, and then his death. There's a lot here, I'm going to tell you. The interesting thing that I want to start with first off is that the majority of the ministers and the clergy and the chaplains, and they were mostly ministers that then became the chaplains. So these pastors were a lot from up north, and the predominant denominations of the day were either the Anglicans, which were more Tories. You had the Congregationalists, which were from the Puritan heritage. You had Presbyterians, which were another predominant one. But the Baptists were in a minority. The Baptists were in a very small minority, not like in our modern day, where Baptists are one of the largest types of denominations that there is in the United States. But we're not going to get into all of that. But the fact is that at this point they were a minority, very small. Okay, very very small. So this becomes very very interesting, and the Baptists then, much like the Baptists today, they really don't get involved in a lot. Okay, they don't get involved in a lot, but this becomes very interesting about Mr. Gano. All right. The Baptists, though not so imposing a denomination in numbers at the time of the Revolution as now, nevertheless, through the weight of their influence, whatever it might be, on the sides of the colonies. Thus, in 1775, we find them in Virginia, presenting as a body an address to the convention in which they say, quote, that however distinguished from the body of their countrymen by appellation and sentiments of a religious nature, they, nevertheless, considered themselves as members of the same community in respect to matters of a civil nature, and embark in the same common cause that, alarmed at the oppression which hangs over America, they had considered what part it would be proper to take in the unhappy contest, and had determined that they ought to make a military resistance against Great Britain in her unjust invasion, tyrannical oppression, and repeated hostilities. End quote. And left their church members to enlist, and asked that 4 of their ministers, whom they had selected, might be allowed to preach to the troops during the campaign with the same freedom as chaplains of the established church. The most distinguished clergyman of this denomination who served during the Revolutionary War was Reverend John Gano, a native of Hopewell, New Jersey. Becoming religious in his early youth, he felt it at times to be his duty to study for the ministry. But so many obstacles stood in the way that he endeavored to drive the subject from his mind. But being unable to do so, he finally yielded to what he felt to be the divine promptings and entered on his studies. These, however, were somewhat desultory, and at the end of 2 or 3 years he took a journey to Virginia with 2 distinguished clergymen who had been appointed by the Philadelphia Association to settle some difficulties existing in some feeble churches there. Traveling through a sparsely settled country, and where the gospel was seldom heard, he found himself so pressed to preach that he finally consented. For this irregular conduct he was called to account when he returned to Hopewell by the Baptist church there, of which he was a member. He, however, expressed no regrets for his course, declaring, quote, that he had no disposition to repent, having sounded the gospel to perishing sinners in Virginia, whose importunities to hear it he could not resist. End quote. It ended in the church setting him apart to preach. Mr. Gano was a little under the medium height, with a slender but firmly knit frame. His countenance was open and frank, and its clear outlook indicated the self-collected, fearless spirit that characterized him. In this southern journey through a comparative wilderness, he often found himself in circumstances that called for all his presence of mind and nerve. One evening he and Mr. Miller, his companion, put up at a tavern where a noisy, profane company had assembled. At his request, the landlord put them in a room remote as possible from the drinking, swearing frontiersmen, and then stepped into the apartment of the latter and asked them not to disturb the travelers who had just arrived. They were just drunk enough to have this reasonable request appear to them a gross insult, and starting up in indignation, they rushed in a body to the room where young Mr. Gano and Mr. Miller were sitting, and with loud oaths demanded who they were. Gano, only 27 years old, calmly replied, quote, "We are civil travelers who wish neither to disturb you nor be disturbed by you." End quote. The man who acted as leader immediately advanced towards him in a threatening manner, and shaking his fist in his face, exclaimed with an oath, pointing to one of his burly comrades, quote, "There is a man who can whip you, anybody else in this room." End quote. Young Gano turned his quiet glance on the bully, thus pointed out, and replied, quote, "Very probably, sir, for he looks much more like a man than you act, and I dare say that he and the rest of his companions are ashamed of you and your conduct." End quote. The ruffian was completely cowed by the cool manner and calm superiority of the young stranger, and before he could recover his self-possession, Gano turned to the landlord, who had just entered, and in that quiet tone of command which men obey without knowing why, he said, quote, "Put that fellow out of the room." End quote. He did so without the others offering the least interference. Gano then turned to them and remarked in his quiet, grave manner that their companion, who had just been turned out of the room, was a striking instance of the depravity of human nature. He then went on to say that God never designed us to make others unhappy, but to benefit and help each other, making them a short but serious speech. They heard him out in silence, then shook hands with him in a friendly manner and wished him a good journey. On another occasion, when just as he was about entering alone, and in the night time, a long piece of woods, he was overtaken by a rough looking man who insisted on accompanying him, although he told him he did not wish his society, seeing from the fellow's bearing and manner that his intentions were evil. Finding that he could not shake him off, he rode quietly on. When he entered the woods and it became so dark that he could not see his brigand companion, he urged his horse up beside him, and placing his hand on his leg so as to detect the least hostile motion, held it there till he came to a clearing. Riding up to the long hut in it, he roused the inmate, who demanded, as he came to the door, what he wanted. Pointing to the stranger who had forced himself on his company, he exclaimed, quote, "Seize that man!" End quote. The latter, alarmed, immediately gave his horse the whip and disappeared into the darkness. The cool determination and self-possession of Gano, evidenced by his deliberately riding to the robber's side in the darkness and laying his hand upon his thigh, so astounded and overawed him that he dared not make his intended attack. It was moral power that subdued him, a superior soul, superior in courage, resolution, and in conscious resources, before which his brutal spirit quailed. These incidents are mentioned to show the mettle of the man who, like Paul, was fitted by nature to be a great military commander, but became by grace a great leader in the church. Soon after his ordination, he was sent back to Virginia as a missionary and labored for several years amid the frontier settlements south. Many anecdotes are told of him while successfully prosecuting his labors here, illustrating both his natural sagacity and elevated piety. In 1758, he was settled over a church in North Carolina, which he afterwards left on account of the war which had broken out with the Cherokees. The governor sent him a captain's commission in the army, but he declined to act under it and returned to New Jersey. He afterwards went to Philadelphia, but stayed only a part of the year, then settled down in New York City, where he built up a flourishing church and congregation with whom he remained till the arrival of the British troops, which dispersed them over the country. Having removed his family to Connecticut, he returned to the city, determined to stay there till the enemy entered it. Colonel Webb's regiment being at Stamford at the time, he was invited by him to become his chaplain. He declined, but accepted an invitation to come out to them and preach once every Sabbath. The simultaneous passage of the enemy's ships up the North and East rivers after the Battle of Long Island and the retreat of Washington gave him no time to remove his household furniture, and leaving everything behind, he mounted his horse and set out for the American camp. He was with the army in the skirmishes at Harlem, retreated with it to Kingsbridge, and thence to White Plains. In the fierce conflict on Chatterton's Hill, he was occasionally under fire. His cool and quiet courage in thus fearlessly exposing himself was afterwards commented on in the most glowing terms by the officers who stood near him. He himself, in speaking of it, said, quote, "My station in time of action I knew to be among the surgeons, but this battle I somehow got in front of the regiment. Yet I durst not quit my place for fear of dampening the spirits of the soldiers, or of bringing on me an imputation of cowardice. Rather than do either, I chose to risk my fate." End quote. One cannot repress a smile at the naive account of himself in the front of battle. When a soldier, whose apportionate place is there, finds himself in the rear, we sometimes hear such lame excuses as, quote, "that somehow he got there," end quote. But for one to use it for being under the enemy's fire when his appointed place is elsewhere is both novel and amusing. If the brave, heroic chaplain had analyzed his feelings a little closer, he would have found that the reasons for staying under fire were really ones that brought him under it. The impulses of his noble, patriotic nature. He saw around him on every side cowardice and fear, and carried away by his own heroic impulses, he involuntarily sought the dangers that he could not bear to see his countrymen so afraid to meet. To one acquainted with the perfectly fearless and chivalrous character of the man, and at the same time familiar with the details of this battle, it is the easiest thing in the world to understand how he came into the exposed position in which he so unaccountably found himself. MacDougall, with 1,500 men, assisted by Alexander Hamilton, attempted to defend the hill, while the main army lay farther back behind the little stream called Bronx River. On the 29th of October, Howe moved across the country with his heavy columns, and instead of assaulting Washington at once, he stopped to carry Chatterton's Hill. As soon as he got his 12 or 15 pieces of artillery within range, he opened on the American lines. The heavy thunder rolling over the heights carried consternation into the ranks of the militia, and as a round shot struck one of their number, mangling him frightfully, the whole turned and fled. Colonel Hazlitt tried in vain to induce them to drag forward the field piece so as to sweep the ascending columns, but he was able to man only one, and that so poorly that he was compelled to seize and drag the ropes himself. But he was denied the gratification of using even this one gun, for as it was being slowly trundled to the front, a ball from the enemy's battery struck the carriage, scattering the shot in every direction and setting fire to a wad of tow. In an instant, the piece was abandoned in terror. Only one man had the courage to remain and tread out the fire and collect the shot. Hamilton, however, with 2 guns in battery, coolly swept the slope, carrying away whole platoons at every discharge. But after a little time, MacDougall found only 600 of the 1,500 with which he commenced the fight, left to sustain the shock of the whole British army. This he did gallantly for a whole hour, then retreated slowly and in good order, taking all his artillery and baggage with him, and crossing the Bronx, joined the main army. It was on such a sight as this the fearless chaplain gazed with a bursting heart, as he saw more than half the army fleeing from the sound of cannon, others abandoning their pieces without firing a shot, and a brave band of only 600 manfully sustaining the whole conflict. He forgot himself, and distressed at the cowardice of his countrymen, and filled with the chivalrous and patriotic sympathy for their little band that scorned to fly, he could not resist the strong desire to share their perils, and eagerly yet involuntarily pushed forward to the front. This is the true explanation of the quote, somehow he got out of his place in the rear and, quote, found himself in the front of the regiment, end quote. Just as it is the reason that he would not retire though cannonballs were crashing around him, a truly brave man can never refrain from stopping to the side or stepping to the side of brave men when, overpowered by numbers, they still make a gallant and desperate stand for the right. He accompanied the army in its retreat to North Castle, where it camped near a meeting house, which was turned into a hospital for the sick and the wounded. Supposing the army would remain here for some time, he obtained a furlough for a few days to visit his family. When he returned, instead of encountering pickets and sentries and bustling encampment, he found the place deserted and silent. Everything had changed like a dream of the night, and he rode slowly forward towards the meeting house. But around it there was not the sign of a living thing. Dismounting at the door, he opened it and passed up the empty aisles. The groups of sufferers he had prayed with there were all gone. Pausing for a moment to contemplate the changed scene, he heard a slight noise, and going in the direction from whence it proceeded, found one poor wounded soldier all alone in a pew with a bottle of water by his side. Ascertaining that the regiment to which he belonged was with General Lee, he hastened forward to join it. The orders had already been received by this officer to effect a speedy junction with the main army concentrated on the banks of the Delaware. Delaying to obey them as long as he dared, he at length set out, but was captured at Baskin Bridge, and that would be General Lee, which you heard about in another story, that he was doing all that delay stuff on purpose, so here's a confirmation of that. Continuing, Gano then accompanied the division which marched rapidly forward to join Washington. He crossed the wintry Delaware with the army when it made its fearful midnight march on Trenton, and shared in the dangers of the battle that followed. Soon after this engagement, the time of the troops to which Gano belonged expired, but Washington urged him to remain 6 weeks longer until reinforcements which he expected should arrive, offering them $10 bounty, though he did not know where the money was to come from. They responded to his urgent appeal, and Robert Morris, that noble patriot, on receiving a letter from Washington stating that what he had done, immediately borrowed $50,000 on his own credit and forwarded it to him, to General Washington, telling him to call on him again when he wanted more. At the expiration of the 6 weeks, the troops were discharged. The officers, however, determined to raise another regiment, and having seen the value of Gano's service, came to him and asked him if he would join them as chaplain if they succeeded in their efforts. He said he would, but on his arrival at home, he found a letter awaiting him from Colonel Dubosc, stationed at Fort Montgomery, just below West Point, asking him to accept the post of chaplain to his regiment. Instead of writing his refusal, he determined to ride across the country to see the colonel and deliver it in person. On his arrival, however, General James Clinton, the commander-in-chief, who had heard of him, joined his solicitation to those of Colonel Dubosc and urged him so warmly to remain that he finally consented and entered at once on the discharge of his duties. The two forts, Montgomery and Clinton, situated near West Point, were considered the key of the Hudson. Yet in 1777, when Burgoyne was pushing his victorious columns on towards Albany, and it was well known that Henry Clinton at New York would make a desperate effort to effect a junction with him, they were garrisoned with only 600 or 700 men. Clinton, aware of their feebleness, determined to capture them, and embarking between 3,000 and 4,000 men, advanced up the Hudson and landed at Verplank's Point to convey the impression that his object was to attack Putnam stationed at Peekskill. But soon as it was dark, he re-embarked his troops and, concealed by a dense fog, crossed the river and, landing at Stony Point at daybreak, entered the defiles that led to the forts. Now, hanging along the sides of the mountain and plunging into deep ravines, he toiled on all day, and driving before him the various detachments set out to arrest his progress, arrived 2 hours before sunset in front of the works. The mountain sides and the thick forest at their base had all the afternoon rung with the sounds of drum and bugle, and volleys of musketry marking both the lines of progress and the rapidity of the advance of the hostile columns. And now, as they drew near, Gano, with his accustomed indifference to danger, walked the breastworks, viewing their approach till the whole open space around the fort was red with the scarlet uniforms. The British immediately commenced a general fire, and he, finding the musket balls flying rather too thickly around him, descended into the fort. In speaking of it afterwards, he said, quote, "I observed the enemy marching up a little hollow, that they might be secured from our firing till they came within 80 yards of us. Our breastwork immediately before them was not more than waistband high, and we had but few men. The enemy kept up a heavy firing till our men gave them a well-directed fire, which affected them very sensibly. Just at this time we had a reinforcement from a redoubt next to us, which obliged the enemy to withdraw. I walked to the embassy, where I had a good prospect, and saw the enemy advancing toward our gate." End quote. It, as he continues, quote, "somehow, as always happens with Gano, forgot the time of action, quote, his place among the surgeons," end quote, and was where he could see how the battle was going. This, quote, advanced toward the gate, quote, as he was observing by Captain Moody in Fort Clinton, who, quote, seeing our desperate situation, gave the enemy a charge of grape shot, which threw them into great confusion. Moody repeated his charge, which entirely dispersed them for that time. End quote. At sunset, a couple of flags were sent demanding the immediate surrender of the fort, and threatening, in case of refusal, to put the garrison to the sword. And what that means is that they would show no mercy and take no prisoners. Okay? Continuing. The two brothers, Clintons, commanding the two forts, sent the same answer to summons, viz., that they choose the latter alternative. On the return of the flags, the firing recommenced, and for 2 hours it flamed and thundered there in the darkness. And when came the final assault, the drums beat a hurried charge, and the overwhelming mass of the enemy poured in one wild torrent over the feeble defenses, and by mere weight of numbers crushed down the little handful that stood so bravely at bay. Gano was in the midst of the melee, and with the rest, when driven back, leaped over the breastworks in the darkness and plunged down the cliffs to the river. Quote, "Many," he says, escaped to the water's side and got on board a scow and pushed off. Before she had got twice her length, we grappled one of our row galleys, into which we all got, and crossed the river." End quote. The fugitives then made their toilsome way to New Windsor, where they arrived several days after. Here they were joined by others who had escaped. On looking over their returns, they found, he says, that, quote, "we had lost, killed, and taken prisoners about 300 men. The enemy, as we afterwards understood, had 1,000 or 1,100 killed, among whom were 18 captains and one or two field officers, besides a great number of wounded." End quote. Wow. So the little band at those forts, they may have had, they said they lost or had killed or taken prisoner about 300 men, but the enemy, they lost 3 times that, basically. That's interesting. Just continue reading. Obtaining a furlough for a short absence, he now returned to his family at New Fairfield, but tarried only till the birth of a daughter relieved his solicitude respecting his wife, when he again started for the army. At the opening of the next campaign, General Clinton's brigade, consisting of 4 regiments, had not a chaplain in it, and he earnestly urged Gano to accept the post. He consented, and soon after received his commission from Congress. During this summer, the brigade was not engaged in active service, and Mr. Gano's duties assumed the quiet character of those of a pastor among his people. At the close of the campaign, it was ordered to take winter quarter at Albany. A large portion of the troops encamped at Canohari, and they sent a request to Clinton that he would let the chaplain come and spend some time with them and preach to them. Well, stop. Here it is, the army, the men, requesting that the chaplain would come and preach. Wow, that's pretty good. All right, here we go. He consented, and Mr. Gano went over to the camp. On his arrival, they asked him to preach a little more about politics than he commonly did. What? Stop! The people are asking the preacher to preach about politics. Wow. Anyway, let's continue. He took for his text the words of Moses to his father-in-law. Quote, "Come, go thou with us, and we will do thee good. For he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, but with us thou shalt be in safeward," or safeguard. End quote. He was always peculiarly happy in the choice of his texts, selecting them in reference to the immediate occasion, while his original mode of treating them in a plain, familiar way of talking, as it were, to the soldiers, never failed to give him an attentive audience. His known coolness in danger, and even complete sang-froid when under fire of the enemy, made him a great favorite with the troops, and indeed an object of admiration as a man to the officers. At this time, the expedition against the Indians of the western New York was organized, and General Sullivan placed at the head of it. He immediately issued orders for the main army to assemble at Wyoming, the seat of the massacre, from which point he determined to ascend the Susquehanna to the Indian settlements. Clinton, in the meantime, received orders to advance up the Mohawk, and crossing over to Otsego Lake, the head of the Susquehanna, form a junction with Sullivan at any point he should designate. 108 flat-bottom boats were provided to convey his troops and provisions, and floated up the Mohawk to Cohonari. Here they were lifted from the water and transported through the woods and swamps 16 miles to Otsego. While part of the army was cutting and making a road for the boats and carrying them across the country, another portion was sent to Otsego to dam the outlet and raise the water in the lake. For it was now midsummer, and Clinton had learned that the Susquehanna was so low that it would be impossible to float the boats down it. The army lay there for 6 weeks, waiting for orders to march, during which time Mr. Gano's labors as chaplain were uninterrupted. In all his intercourse with the troops, he kept in view the duties of his station, and never suffered an opportunity to pass in which he would rebuke sin or put in a word of admonition. One morning, as he was going to the regimental prayers, he passed by a group of officers, one of whom, not seeing him approach, was swearing in an excited manner. The other officers saluted the chaplain as usual, when the profane lieutenant, turning quickly around, saw him, and checking himself, said, quote, "Good morning, doctor." Gano replied, "Good morning. I see you pray early." The abashed officer colored and stammered out, quote, I beg your pardon, sir." And Gano replied, "Oh," passing on, "I cannot pardon you. You must carry your case to God." End quote. On another occasion, he was standing near some soldiers who was disputing respecting whose duty it was to cut wood for one of the campfires. At length, one exclaimed in an angry manner, quote, "I'll be if I will do it." End quote. Soon after finding he must, he took up the axe to perform it. Gano immediately stepped forward and, reaching out his hand, said, "Give me that axe." "Oh, no," replied the soldier. "The chaplain shan't cut wood." "Yes, but I must," Gano said. "Why?" said the soldier in surprise. "Because I just heard you say you would be damned if you would cut it, and I'd rather do it for you than you should be made miserable forever." Oh, the longest homily on the guilt of profanity would not have produced such the effect on the soldiers that this indirect rebuke did. The army lay here on the 4th of July, and General Clinton prepared to celebrate the day with appropriate ceremonies. Having in my possession the original order book of Clinton, kept during this expedition, I insert the order he issued on this occasion as a curiosity. Quote, "This day being the anniversary of the independence of America, the General is pleased to order that all troops under his command should draw a gill of rum per man, extraordinary, in memory of that happy event. At 1 o'clock this afternoon, at fatigue party, composed of 4 captains, 4 subordinates, 8 sergeants, 200 rank and file, will assemble in the usual place of parade in front of the camp with hatchets or axes to clear the ground of brush and other inconveniences which are thereon, for the purpose of parading the army for the feu de joie. Lieutenant Colonel Willett will take command of the above party. The commanding officers of the regiments will see that on inspection of the ammunition in the respective regiments be made through the different companies, and if there is any spoiled cartridges, 3 of them will be allowed for every soldier for the feu de joie. In lieu of which, those who shall not be provided, the different quartermaster will make a return to the conductor of military stores to be supplied with spoiled or blank cartridges, 3 per man. The troops now in camp will parade for that purpose in front of the encampment at 3:30 this afternoon, 1 line from right to left. Each battalion will take place as they are now in camp. Then follows the names of the officers. After feu de joie is finished, a sermon will be preached by the brigade chaplain on this happy event, and it is the general's pleasure that the troops under his command will assemble at 7 o'clock every evening while we remain in this place upon the grand parade for prayers. The general expects that every troop will be clean as possible and begs that every officer will exert himself on the subject. End quote. Wow. Commentary from me. That was the general orders to what was going to happen. Amazing. And for 7 days, the whole army there was going to get together and pray. Okay. Wow. What's that about in modern times? Or not about? All right, continuing. The parade being finished, Mr. Gano mounted a platform and casting his eye over the glittering ranks whose bright uniforms were thrown into strong relief by the green woods that surrounded them, exclaimed, quote, "This day shall be a memorial unto you throughout your generations." End quote. Officers and men listened with the deepest attention as he spoke of the time when the day on which the Declaration of Independence was given to the world would be celebrated like the Jews' Passover, with thanksgiving and public rejoicing, and kept as a perpetual memorial of God's deliverance of his people. All right, I got to stop. You see, I have to stop for everybody, including those in particular on YouTube, is that the intent of the celebrations of the 4th of July were not just fireworks and parties and barbecues, but a perpetual memorial of God's deliverance of his people. That's the 4th of July. All right, continuing. In speaking of it, he said, quote, "On this occasion the soldiers behaved with the most decency that I ever knew them to during the war. Some of them usually absented themselves from worship on Lord's Day, and the only punishment they were subject to was the digging up of stumps, which in some instances had a good effect." End quote. The long delay at this point was very vexatious, and the nightmare seemed to rest on the expedition. Gano, who saw that both officers and privates were getting very impatient, at length spoke to Clinton on the subject. Quote, "The general," he says, "informed him that he had received orders to march, and that he should move the next Monday. He requested me not to mention it till after service the next day, which was Sunday. I preached to them from these words, quote, 'being ready to depart on the morrow.'" End quote. The soldiers, who were accustomed to look for a deep meaning in his text, in his very text, listened with more than common interest to the sermon that followed. As soon as services closed, Clinton assembled the officers and ordered that each captain should detail a certain number of men from his company to draw the boats from the lake and string them along the Susquehanna below the dam and load them so that they might be ready to depart in the morning. The following day at sunrise the camp broke up, and though the dam had been opened several hours previous, yet the swell it had occasioned in the river served to carry the boats over the shoals and flats, which otherwise would have been impassable. There had been a long drought, and it was, therefore, a matter of profound wonder to the Indians down the river, for above 100 miles, what could have occasioned such an astonishing freshet. The soldiers marched along both banks, expecting the invalids who went with the boats and with the barges and the provisions. End quote. Thus, the host streamed on through the forest, lining the picturesque shores of the Susquehanna with their gay uniforms, while the long fleet of boats, and I have to stop to qualify, kids and people, that word gay is not what it means in modern times. Gay meant happy uniform, glorious uniform. It was a word of happiness, not what it's been perverted to be in our modern day. So let me continue then. So they went down the shores of the Susquehanna with their gay uniforms, while the long fleet of boats wound like a huge serpent between. Day after day they toiled on, and at length came in sight of Sullivan's tents at Cuyahoga, when loud shouts from both armies made the wilderness ring. The whole army then took up its line of march for the Genesee Flats. The Battle of Newton followed, in which the Indians, though under the leadership of Butler and Brant, were completely routed. After the battle was over, the different divisions of the army were collected. Quote, "We saw ourselves," says Gano, "surrounded by a large field of Indian corn, pumpkins, squash, beans, which was no unpleasant sight to the soldiers who were hungry as we were. Here General Sullivan displayed his generalship by putting the army on half allowance, that we might more effectually secure the victory by pursuing the Indians. Our success and the exhortation of our officers induced the soldiery to a cheerful compliance, and they consequently sent up a loud huzzah. An Irishman, observing this, said he had been a long time in the British army, and some time in the service of America, but he never heard soldiers cry huzzah for half allowance before. However, as they all had, he would, and shouted lustily, scattering the Indians from its paths and burning their towns as it advanced. The army at least reached the point of its destination, the beautiful Genesee Flats. Here it camped overnight, and in the morning, while Gano stood looking over the amazing fields of waving corn that spread away on every side, he heard the heavy boom of cannon sullenly swelling over the western wilderness. It was the morning gun of the English at Niagara, whither the Indians were supposed to be fled. Laying waste those vast fields ripe for the sickle, the Indians' only hope for the coming winter, the army took up its retrograde march for Easton. But here, says Gano, I must not forget to mention a circumstance peculiarly pleasing to me. 2 or 3 young soldiers were under great distress of mind concerning their souls, and frequently came to see and converse with me. As he witnessed the destruction of the grain and imagined the despair of the Indians when they should return and see their fields laid waste, and think of the suffering that awaited them in the coming winter, the righteous punishment for obeying the orders of a tyrannical king, a text often occurred to him, which he one day mentioned to General Sullivan. Quote, "They shall walk through them, be an hungry, and curse their God and king, and look upwards." End quote. Thus the general said, "We will have a sermon from that text, and when we arrive at Easton, you shall preach it." After the return of the army, Gano obtained a furlough in order to visit his family. The next winter, the division to which he was attached encamped near Newbury, and his family were at Warwick, not far distant. He was at home a considerable part of the time. When Washington collected the army in New Jersey and began to erect large ovens, everyone supposed he designed to attack the British in New York. But the combined armies, French and American, suddenly broke up their camps and made that forced march into Virginia, by which Cornwallis was shut up at Gloucester Point and compelled to capitulate. Gano, with others, was so taken by surprise at the sudden movement that he was wholly unprepared to march, having, he said, but one change of linen. That means change of his underclothes. Okay? Stating his destitute condition to General Clinton, he asked leave for absence to get more, but the general refused his request and said he must go on at all events with the division. Luckily, when they arrived in Newark, he found an old lady who had been a member of his church in New York. I told her, he says, my situation, and she furnished me what was needful for the campaign. The army was hurried on at top of its speed, but when Clinton's division reached Baltimore, his aide was taken sick, and he asked Gano to remain behind with him till he was able to proceed. He did so, and in speaking of the event says, quote, the major's anxiety to follow the army retarded his recovery. However, he attempted it and set out, but after 1 or 2 days he was obliged to lay by. In a day or two he was set off again, but did not reach the army before the British capitulated. However, we partook of the joy with our brethren. That, quote, joy of the brethren was a true joy. Without were shouts, acclamations, and boisterous exultations of the enthusiastic soldiers, but within, among the noble chaplains of the army, were devout thanksgiving, humble, grateful prayers, and tears of joy too deep for utterances. Mr. Gano returned to Newbury, where the army erected huts to live in during the winter, and one larger than the rest for a place of public worship on Sabbath. Here 3 services a day were held, the chaplains from each brigade preaching in rotation. Thus passed the winter, while rumors of peace filled the land with hope and delight. In the spring, the British evacuated New York, and Gano returned to the city to find his house dilapidated and plundered. His scattered congregation, such as were living, soon returned, and he settled down once more to his pastoral labors. He continued here for some time, but attracted by representations made to him of the growing state of Kentucky, and hoping to relieve himself from debt which he saw no way of canceling in his present position, he removed thither in 1781, much to the disappointment and regret of his church. He settled near Frankfort, where he died in 1804 in the 75th year of his age. A fall from his horse in 1798, followed by a paralytic shock, rendered him a cripple the last 6 years of his life. But he never ceased his labors, sometimes preaching while lying on his back. Calm and resigned, he saw death approach without a terror, and to a friend who asked him if he wanted to go home and be with Christ, he faintly, sweetly answered, yes. This was the last utterance of his lips on earth, and the Christian and patriot passed to that better land reserved for the people of God. True to his country, true to his high office, true to his God, he went through the trying scenes of the Revolution, and through life honored, respected, and loved by all who knew him, and now sleeps with those whose names are inscribed in the hearts of their countrymen. What a story. What a story of John Gano. Wow. Well, children, there's a lot we can make, and Papa can make lots of commentary, but we're not. This has been a long section. And so the next time we're going to go to chapter 26 and talk about Charles Cummings, who was an Irishman by birth. So that should be a very interesting one. Talk to you shortly.